Back on the record after our lunch break, the defendant, Mr. Rivera, is present along with all the attorneys of record. Mr. Leslie, I want to remind you, you are still under oath. Mr. Freeze, you may continue with your direct examination of this witness.
Very well. Mr. Leslie, when we were talking about time code burns on the video you viewed here. I think I left off with the technology that's available today that you view typically. Typically, do you see time code burns on most videos that you review from law enforcement?
I wouldn't say on most. Generally, it's about 50-50. And but like I said, there's no reason for time code burns not to be on because the ability to place them on most video equipment is pretty common nowadays.
And what's the relevance to time code burns as it pertains to ensuring that a video that you have is quality and of the best quality available?
Well, and that is transparency as well. So it allows you to know if, for example, if it had been edited in any way, shape, or form, and where with audio you don't have that ability most of the time. You just have to go with whatever you get.
And in this case, there were no time code burns on the video you saw?
No, there was not.
And the video that you reviewed, there were some concerns with the audio syncing with what you were seeing.
That's correct, yes.
So that just gives you concerns that you can't say to a degree of certainty whether or not any edits were made.
No, and nor would I go there. But the fact is that when you have, it was obviously a copy, I would believe. It wasn't an authentic transfer from one to another of a master.
Now, in your capacity as a forensic expert, as it comes with coercive interrogation techniques, are there certain techniques that law enforcement uses typically that you see used on a daily basis?
Yes, the general standard, and it's also taught this way as well, is minimizations, maximizations. And minimizations are basically minimizing the culpability for the suspect to believe that it's not really that big of that big of a deal. That maximization is basically when they're over exaggerating the case that they might have. You also have things like, for example, narrative traps, which is basically a narrative trap is a constructed question, no matter how it's answered, becomes incriminating to the individual. So if it's a question that's constructed in such a way that they have to answer it, it may appear incriminating. So that is then used later on in the interrogation.
And these are techniques used by law enforcement that are taught?
Generally speaking, the minimization, maximizations are taught. Basically, narrative traps are not necessarily constructed purposely. They're just constructed because they have an idea of what they want to achieve in this interrogation. And the point of an interrogation, of course, is to get a confession, whereas an interview is fact-finding in nature.
Let's take a minute and just kind of delineate the difference.
Okay.
There's an interview that you speak of, and then there's an interrogation that you speak of. Tell us first what an interview is.
All right. An interview is basically a fact-finding interview. It's usually, the interviewer is usually making notes at the time. It's at a point in an investigation where they're establishing whether or not there's sufficient evidence to proceed any further with, and also vetting witnesses, victims in this case, or in certain cases. Whereas an interrogation is accusatory in nature. The established element to get to an interrogation is presumption of guilt. So in other words, that depending on whether or not they're using a inductive or deductive method of investigation, deductive meaning the fact that they establish a theory based on evidence that they may have. Now that evidence may be flawed, so therefore the theory may be flawed, but nevertheless that they believe that they have enough sufficient evidence to conduct an interrogation. At that point, an interrogation, there should already be the established investigative method that was already established to establish the information or the facts of the case. Inductive is different in the sense that it is basically vetting the information that a witness may provide vetting the information that a victim may provide, and all information is accepted, whereas in a deductive method, it's not accepted necessarily, it's mostly inculpatory. Whereas in inductive, all information is accepted, vetted, and then inferences are drawn, and as a result of those inferences, a reasonable conclusion is made.
So
Interviewer would like to ask the witness to slow down.
Sorry.
So with an interview, in an investigation, that's the information collecting phase from anyone who may have information, right?
That's correct.
That could be a witness to a crime or a victim or anyone who may have information at all, correct?
That's correct.
But an interview can shift into an interrogation very quickly.
It can, yes.
And you say that happens when law enforcement shifts into a presumption of guilt? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they've already established that they believe that the individual that they're targeting is, in fact, the individual that they believe perhaps is a suspect or a person of interest even.
Okay, so describe what you mean when you use the term person of interest or a suspect.
Okay, so a person of interest may be as a result of an interview. They may escalate themselves to potentially having some knowledge or some participation in a crime, whereas if they're a suspect, that escalates them one step further.
Okay. And then with this presumption of guilt comes what you call the deductive method of investigation, correct?
Deductive or inductive, you have to establish the presumption of guilt to go into an interrogation, which means you pretty much have already established the facts of the case, and you're now going into the next stage, which is to get a confession.
So with an inductive method of investigation, you've collected all your evidence, you've got your ducks in a row, so to speak, right?
Both looking at exculpatory and inculpatory evidence, both. Whereas deductive doesn't necessarily look at exculpatory. It looks more like for inculpatory evidence.
So deductive is perhaps starting at a conclusion and backing up from it.
Well, it's also not accepting certain evidence that may not fall within the narrative you're trying to create.
Are there other techniques that officers have been trained or you've seen used in your training and experience?
Well, those are the two main ones that are used in, but there's many different ones that I look at. For example, narrative integration, where the interviewer has, for example, a narrative in mind that they believe has occurred, and they place that narrative in words and questions that basically they want the suspect or the person being interviewed to take on that narrative. They're suggesting the narrative, and in hopes that perhaps that they're going to buy into the narrative.
Now, are there times or classes of people that you find that can be more vulnerable to techniques than others?
Well, there's vulnerabilities. For example, when a person, for example, has potentially a low IQ. Now, this is not, you have to look at a lot of factors, but when you're looking at vulnerabilities, for example, in a blackout confession, let's use that as an example, where you have an individual who is a drug user, perhaps, or an alcoholic, and the suggestion in the interview is that they perhaps committed this offense while they were blacked out, because maybe they've explained that they have some blackouts. And then that is used as a potential narrative suggested to them over the next 2 hours. And as a result of it, they may take on that narrative and say, well, yeah, maybe it was when I did that. And so as a result of that, it's not reliable.
Any other vulnerabilities we look
Sure.
for?
There's low IQs. There can be issues involving basically religious beliefs. There can be issues involving sleep deprivation.
And with these vulnerabilities, how does that affect your analysis of an interrogation or an interview?
Well, what I look at is what is the vulnerability. If it's something that is a medical issue, I always ask the attorneys to bring on an expert in that medical field, in that particular discipline. simply because I can use that for the purposes of determining whether or not that would have been a vulnerability.
How many hours did you spend reviewing the evidence that was submitted by me to you in this case?
I'm going to say probably close to 45 hours.
And you wrote a report in this case, correct?
That's correct.
And that's been admitted previously as Defendant's Exhibit X. You have that report with you today?
I do.
And that report you wrote, how many hours did you invest in writing that report?
Oh, this report probably, I'm going to say 15 hours.
You also prepared a slide presentation, a PowerPoint presentation as it pertains to primarily the issue of sleep deprivation, did you not?
That's correct.
How many hours did you spend on that?
Probably 3.
So you have over 60 hours invested in this particular case.
That's correct.
Directing you to your report, Mr. Leslie, are there areas in that report that you want to direct the court to that, or strike that? Did you find evidence in this case of coercive interrogation techniques being used?
I did find areas that are, when I use the word coercive, I use the words as pertaining to the sleep deprivation aspect that would affect that, I believe. And these are minimizations, which I have found some minimizations throughout in all 7 videos, as well as narrative integration, as well as maximization.
When you reviewed the videos, in your opinion, did you see Mr. Rivera acting in a way that placed him in a vulnerable state?
In my opinion, I had gone through the video very specifically. Keep in mind, I don't understand Spanish, so I was only looking at the visuals. And what I was looking at specifically was the amount of times that he appeared tired, sleeping, fast asleep, unable to wake up. And I had made, I believe there was 60 instances of that during the 7 videos.
And you screenshot 60 instances,
That's correct.
and that's what forms your slide presentation.
That's correct.
And during those 60 instances where he appeared sleepy or somehow tired, that kicked into mind some sort of vulnerability that Mr. Bahena may have.
Well, in this particular case, I was very concerned with the amount of minimizations, maximizations, narrative traps, narrative integrations that were used in result of that with the sleep deprivation.
You're not a sleep deprivation expert.
No, I'm not.
But did the level and extent of the times where you saw Mr. Bahena appear to you to be obviously tired or sleeping set off a red flag for you to contact counsel?
Yes, it was very concerning.
Was it your suggestion that a sleep deprivation expert be consulted?
Absolutely.
You weren't offering an opinion as to whether or not he was sleep deprived.
No, I wanted to first hear from a sleep deprivation expert.
Now, in your report, which is Exhibit X, you say you have first examples, and I don't want to go through all of them,
No.
but of minimization.
Okay.
Can you direct me to what page on your report where you
Okay.
first have that, where you deem it an issue of minimization?
Okay, so for example, on page 72 is an example. Let me
All right, just give us a second to get there.
yeah. So page 72.
I'm going to pull it up here on the screen.
Sure.
I have my counsel pull it up on the screen.
Yeah, so, yeah, where it says page 3, line 4 to 17. Now, I have, in that area, I've outlined all of the ones in that particular, on part 2. This is from part 2 of the video. So in the, do you want me to read
Well, what part are you referring to?
Well, I'm referring to each one of these where it says, page 3, line 4 to 17, till you get to the next headline. That's one area of minimization.
Okay. So there's a part there that says PR colon, and then it's bolded.
Yes,
It says sometimes we do things that sometimes we don't want to do.
that's correct.
We know now that PR is Pamela Romero.
That's correct.
Just kind of summarize there, if you would, what you're seeing in your opinion.
So the most important part of the minimization in that particular area was, further down, you'll see it says PR colon, and I don't blame you. That would be minimizing the culpability. They don't blame them. So, and it's not just one minimization that makes a difference. It's several of them where they get into a position where they start believing that it's not really that big of a deal, or perhaps they've got a way out, or perhaps they're minimizing to the point where they're not going to be culpable of what they perhaps are being accused of.
Did you find another instance of minimization?
Yes, go to page 73. Where it says, page 15, line 29 to 40, okay. Where it says, on the top, PR, if you tell me right now, PR, further down it says, I turned around, I wanted to see her again. And then PR says, it's not anything, there's nothing wrong with that. So in other words, basically enabling permission, saying, well, there's nothing wrong with that, which in a mind of somebody that potentially is not paying a lot of attention, perhaps to a vulnerability, sleep
I
deprivation.
want to object to the witness speculating as to anybody's mindset, what they thought, how it affected them. I have no problem with him identifying what minimizations are or where they may appear in the transcript, but crossing over into how they actually affected people in this case, I think is improper.
Sustained.
All right.
So let me ask you a question. In that line there where you seem to bold and underline a phrase that says there's nothing wrong with that, you identify that as minimization.
Yes, correct.
In your training and experience, what's the purpose of such a statement?
Well, it's to relax or make the accused or the suspect feel at ease.
And that's a law enforcement technique.
That's true.
Was there another situation where we have minimization?
Sure, and go to page 74.
And where on page 74?
Line 34, 28 to 41.
Okay.
PR at the top, I think that I appreciate you trusting me and I want to help you.
The problem there is I want to help you.
That's correct. And then further follows up down UFF at the very last line. I have to, but we are going to review it with the intention that I can help you.
Now that's minimization.
Yes.
And in your training and experience, a statement like that is told to an individual who's being interrogated. Why?
Once again, to relax the individual, to make them feel like they're not out there by themselves.
So in this transcript, did you see a number of situations where the term help was used?
There was, but I couldn't tell you just off the top of my head.
The terminology using the word help, or we're going to help you, is that a technique used by law enforcement?
Well, I mean, that's subjective. Personally, myself, I would not use that that language.
Why not?
It implies that potentially that I'm going to help you get through this and don't worry about it. I don't like that kind of language when I was doing interviews.
Subject to interpretation, you say?
Exactly.
How does that fit in with somebody in potentially a vulnerable state in your experience?
Well, I don't want to speculate once again, but it wouldn't be something that would be beneficial to them. They would potentially believe that.
What's the purpose overall, generally, of an interrogation?
To get a confession.
Is it to seek the truth?
No, the truth is already established prior to going into an interrogation. The primary purpose of an interrogation is to get a confession.
So in a typical or a good investigation, one that's been done correctly, let's say, and don't know if that's the right term,
Use an inductive method would be a correct word.
using the inductive method where you've collected your evidence,
Vetted it.
vetted it, the confession is kind of like the icing on the cake.
Correct.
The interrogation is kind of like the icing on the cake.
That's correct.
You really don't need the statement of the person of interest to make your case.
Not necessary. You shouldn't have to have that.
Okay. So are there any other issues of minimization in your report you want to refer us to?
Well, there's many, but I made some notes of just a few
Okay.
that I could look at again.
Are there any issues of maximization?
All right. Okay, page 78.
And where are we there?
Okay, let's see, 78. Line 6, or page 6, line 31 to 44. All right, so on that particular one where it says, PR says, you know that we could have prints. We could have video. The forensics and everything. That would be maximizing what evidence they might have, suggesting that they might have evidence against him.
What's the relevance of that?
Well, it plays a lot with showing them that, yes, we've already have our evidence. That really anything you tell us at this point is just going to be helping yourself. That would be the point of having maximization.
Seems to me that we're seeing a lot of different techniques here. We're seeing minimization, we're seeing maximization. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of a shotgun approach as to the type of interrogation that's going on.
Sure.
Is there an issue with that?
Well, you know, interviews and interrogations are conducted differently by different people. So to say that one's better than another, it depends on the individual, it depends on how they decided they wanted to approach this.
Okay. But if one person is using a number of different techniques, minimization, maximization, does that affect the validity at all of the statement?
I'm going to object to that question. Whether or not the statement's valid or not is not the subject of this witness's testimony.
Sustained.
Thank you.
If one uses a number of techniques, does it cause you in your training and experience to question the veracity of the statement?
Yes, it would, based on any type of vulnerability also involved.
Judge, I'm going to object.
Okay.
It's not this witness's, within his purview to question or to make any statement concerning the credibility of the statement given by Rivera or the statement of the officers. He can testify to general techniques, what effect they might have, but I think he crosses the line whenever he starts commenting on the credibility of the statement.
That objection's overruled. You can go ahead and finish his answer.
Okay, what was, I'm sorry.
Can you read the question back, please?
There are a number of techniques. Does it cause you in your training and experience to question the veracity of a statement? And his answer, yes, it would, based on any type of vulnerability also involved.
In your training and experience, having done 2,000 plus interviews, is lying to a suspect or a person of interest ever good police work?
It doesn't, I mean, it's used constantly. I mean, it's trained in the techniques that are taught. It doesn't necessarily mean that it, in itself, is going to harm the interrogation. The individual knows what they did and what they didn't do. So by using, but once again, I'm going to get into the vulnerability of an individual. If you have a vulnerable person in a room and you're now using these types of techniques, these are more effective techniques and may solicit the wrong replies.
Any more examples of maximization you see from the transcript, sir, or from your
All
report?
right, just a second. Yeah. Okay, so page 87, 87, page 5, 1 to 18. 1 to 18. Oops, down, yeah, there. Okay. All right, so in this particular case, I'm just going to go down a little bit where it's UM2, I have it in bold, because we have GPS evidence. And then, and where she was running. And then it goes down, the technology she had. I'm just going to go down a little further. And it doesn't lie. Establishing that, in fact, we have GPS evidence. This GPS evidence never lies. That's what basically they're saying to the individual.
And once again, conveying to the person interviewed.
That this, along with other maximizations, would show that, yes, it's overwhelming evidence. And what happens in these situations, ultimately over a longer period of time, which this interrogation lasted 11 hours, 15 minutes, I believe I noted, just in the county sheriff's office. That has nothing to do with later on. But that was 11 hours, 15 minutes. That's an extensive length for an interrogation. Generally, interrogations that I look at very seldomly go past 6 hours, very seldomly. I mean, that's just my own personal experience.
Is there a conclusion that can be drawn from that?
Well, what happens in these types of situations when you have extensive amounts of interrogation time, you also have to determine what evidence was really at that point. When a person is not confessing to something, you then have to ask yourself, did you have the specific evidence prior to going into the interrogation, the presumption to go into that interrogation? I'm not saying there wasn't, I'm just saying that going that length of time, and throughout this interview, Rivera had maintained his innocence completely through, except for the last, I believe, 4 pages of the interrogation itself. Now, I'm not going to say 4, I'm just guessing it's around 4 to 6, I believe, pages where a confession started to come out. But when you're going into 11 hours of an interrogation, and at that particular time, you've got to wonder, are these techniques having some influence in that? And I'm not going to presume anything, but I'm just saying when you're dealing with length, you're dealing with vulnerability, you're dealing with using techniques like this, as a totality, all of them, you can't really rely on it, in my opinion.
Do you see any more issues of maximization?
Well, I have several in the report, but I've just made some notes of some. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So if you go to page 89, yeah. No, sorry. No, sorry. That's minimization. Just a second. No, I made no other maximizations in there.
Did you make any notes in your report of any other coercive techniques?
Yeah, I have one. I think I located it. A narrative trap, for example, just so you can see an example of a narrative trap.
And again, just refresh us quickly on a narrative
A
trap.
narrative trap is basically a constructed question that is asked in such a way that no matter how they answer it, they are incriminating themselves to a certain degree. Maybe not necessarily in the complete picture, but it starts them putting them in a position where maybe they were at a scene for a different reason, but it's assumed that it's another reason why they're doing it. But if we go to page 70.
Pardon me? What page?
70. Okay. Okay, so if you go into page, where it says page 39, lines 13 to 22. The question then is PR. She was pretty, right? She was pretty. And Rivera says, yeah, she looks pretty. And then PR, yeah, the girl was nice. And Rivera says, yeah. PR says, 20 years old, very young. Rivera, yeah, well, at that age, everybody's pretty. And then PR, but in person, you didn't. And then Rivera, no, never. You saw her, you never met her in person. No, I did not. But the upper portions are, the questioning is suggesting that in fact, that he was attracted to her, and that was why he suggestively went after her. But I mean, that's just one thing of many, that totality of it draws that inference.
So in this transcript, you saw several areas of narrative traps.
Several, not an overwhelming amount, but several that I've made note of in the report.
Did you make any more notes, if any?
Let me just, yeah, okay, let me go to another one. Okay, so PR, oh, sorry, I'm going to go page 75. Be on 75. Okay, yeah, and go up to page 12, line 31 to 45. All right, so PR starts running in the same DI driving or the same direction that the girl was running. And he said, and Rivera says, I don't think so. You don't think that's possible? Well, that it could be possible. It's possible, right? But I wouldn't know. I have like a reason. It's kind of broken up there. To go like on that same direction. So he's saying, but I wouldn't have a reason to go in that same direction, but it is possible. So the suggestion is it possible that this happened? Well, I guess it's possible. Suggesting, once again, attributing to other things that are similar to that in narrative traps.
What about injecting narrative? Did you find any evidence of that?
All right, yes. All right, so let's go to page 76. All right, so page 76, page 16, line 11 to 39, where it says, are we over there? Okay, so it says, right, PR, right, we have eyes and we have to be honest with things. I know, I'm not a man, but like you guys, yeah, and then Rivera, yeah, and then PR, looking, and then it's unintelligible. And then Rivera, well, women too, they look, and basically going into, so she's suggesting, and then she goes, PR says then, she was pretty, attractive. Rivera says, yes, like I say, so then. And then it goes to the next page. And then PR, that's the next page, yeah. She had a body. PR, and then it's unintelligible, and then PR, physically fit. Rivera, yeah. PR. So then, do you understand why I'm saying that you are not being honest? Yeah. PR, you turned around in an area where she was running with the hope of seeing her again. So that's a narrative that she's presuming that that's why he's turning around. And then she goes in further and says, with hopes of seeing her again. And then he says no. Rivera says no. And then PR, or with that, or Cristhian, you turned around because you wanted to see her again. So there. And then it goes into page 22 below that, where it says page 22, line 2841. And then she continues by going and saying, And this, I believe that's a different page, because I just double check something. No, that's later on page 22. She then says, you were attracted to her, you liked her, you saw her physically, yeah. And then Rivera, yeah. PR, you brake, you see her, you accelerate the car, yeah. You turned around, Rivera says. And then PR, you accelerated, you know the word, right? You know that word, right? Rivera says, yeah. So you take less time to return to where the girl is. And then Rivera, yes, I'm telling you, I didn't return like just when I turned around. And then PR, no. So once again, assuming that he was attracted to her, he turned around, trying to build this narrative of that's why he went after her a second time. Okay. And then,
Well, let me stop you there.
yeah, go ahead.
There were other times in your report where you refer to Pamela Romero focusing on vulnerabilities that Mr. Bahena had, such as his daughter. What's the relevance of that?
Well, once again, it's in the one time that she makes reference to that. The reason why I made a note of it in the report was I always make notes of if it's starting to become an area where they're concentrating on the vulnerability, perhaps the individual is looking at their family as being effective as basically a component of what they're using to draw a conclusion or basically make them feel that they owe it to their family or they owe it to their daughter. And I believe there was, and I don't want to say anything about it because it's not, I can't right away find it in my report. But I do believe there was something like that in the report.
Okay. We'll let your report speak for itself on that issue. There were periods of time where law enforcement got confrontational a little bit with Mr. Bahena. Do you recall that?
Yes, somewhat aggressive. I mean, basically they were accusatory. And there was a few times where it got aggressive, but not to the degree where it could have got worse. I mean, it was not anything that flagged myself.
Well, that's where we should talk a little bit about the difference between an interview and an interrogation, because just the way an interview versus interrogation is set up, just even in the room, is different, right?
That's correct.
Talk about how an interview, just the layout of a room, is different than an interrogation.
Sure. If you go into, for example, if you could just give me a second here. An example of, if you go to page 11, all right there. So if you take a look at this photo here, there's basically, you see three people in a room. One is at the end of the table, one is at the other end of the table, and another one is watching the interview. That would be considered an interview style. That's not in the sense of an interrogation style. Now, if you go into...
Well, let me stop you there. There's been a lot of talk about whether the door to the room was open and whether Mr. Bahena was free to leave and go about his day. In that situation, that's clearly an interview in your mind.
Yes.
Okay. When it changes to an interrogation style, we'll talk about that in a minute, does that change the analysis?
Visually, now we're talking visually, because I couldn't listen to, because it was in Spanish, so I couldn't tell you specifically if it was...
But visually, when the style appears to change to you, does that change your opinion as to what's going on in that room?
Yes.
Okay, let's look at the next photo then.
What page is that? See, in this particular case, she's showing him photos, during that period of time. So it still, could be still in an interview process. But look, can I bring you to a point where you want to see an interrogation film?
I'll let you see the difference, please.
Okay, so let me just go through there. All right, go to page 34. Okay. Now, in this particular photo here, this would be typical interrogation. You move within 2 feet of the person's personal space, and then you become confrontational in the sense of basically accusatory. It's not necessarily has to be loud or aggressive in any nature, but you're in the person's personal space. You're looking at them straight in the eye, and you're intruding on their personal space, which is intimidating to most people. And during an interrogation, that is exactly where you should be when you're doing an interrogation.
And that's your training and experience telling you this?
That's correct.
So this is switched from an interview to an interrogation, in your opinion?
That's correct.
Mr. Bahena's body language there, does that indicate anything to you based upon your training and experience?
He's got his hand out like this. I would assume he's, denying whatever. But I mean, I don't want to say that definitely.
In your training and experience, when an interview becomes an interrogation,
Correct.
how does that interplay with someone being advised of their Miranda advisory?
I won't object concerning any legal conclusions he may want to draw as to whether or not Miranda was needed or required at this point.
Sustained.
In your training and experience, in an interrogation style such as this, is that person typically advised that they're free to leave?
Judge, I'm going to object to relevance and on the same basis as the previous question.
Overruled.
Well, he's in a position where he's placed into a corner, blocked by the interrogator. The idea is at that particular point, he's not going to be leaving, in his mind anyway.
And is that a tactic?
Wait a second, I'm going to object to that statement. He cannot speculate as to what Cristhian Rivera was thinking at any point in time.
Sustained.
Okay.
When officers are trained to interrogate an individual, are they taught to get in an individual's space?
Well, generally speaking, the space wouldn't be in a corner like that anyway. The space would be usually, they would pull the other chair out and they'd be face to face. In this particular case, he moved his chair closer, and that's only the difference there.
What's the purpose of getting closer?
In the personal space, it's more intimidating to the individual when you're trying to get him to focus on what you're saying, and when you're talking to him in these terms, he's not going to look elsewhere. He's not going to be doing other things. He's going to be focusing on what you're telling him.
And that's a trained technique.
That's a training technique.
Did you take note in your review of the videos if Cristhian Bahena was afforded any food?
Yes.
There's been a lot of talk about whether he was allowed to eat, and we've heard about that, but no one really said what and how much he was allowed to eat.
Yes, he was at one point allowed, he was given food and allowed, I believe it was 30 minutes for him to eat.
Recall what he was given?
Just a second, hold on. It was a plate with I'm not sure exactly what it was, but it was one thing that was on the plate.
Judge, I think there's testimony in this record that there was a sandwich that was provided to him.
Specifically Subway.
I believe that's correct.
Recall it being a sandwich?
Well, I quite honestly, I couldn't identify what it was on the plate. I do have, there's a snapshot of it. But I just, yeah, okay, page 30. Okay, so that's the only identification of anything that I saw that was being eaten. Outside of that, I couldn't tell you what it was. I just, that was the only time that he was afforded anything to eat.
Okay.
And she did then leave him for a period of time for him to eat.
So, Mr. Leslie, after complete examination of the video interview with Mr. Bahena, do you have an opinion as to what method of investigation law enforcement used?
Well, I'm going to, because I didn't look at every aspect of the investigation, including what other elements that they had, I believe that, in my opinion, that it was focused more on the deductive method that they had already, by the time they got into this room, they had already suspected that he was a person of interest at the farm, upgraded to a suspect at the sheriff's county interview room, and at that particular point, that's the only part I could say about the investigation.
Well, tell us what caused you to conclude that you opine that they used the deductive method of investigation.
Well, just the fact that there was information that I believe that that I had no knowledge of whether they had it, but there was questions that were not specifically asked that I had noted in the investigation itself, like when they were interviewing.
Were there facts in your analysis that caused you to have an opinion that Cristhian Bahena was vulnerable to coercive interrogation and interview techniques?
Based on the sleep deprivation aspect and the amount of various techniques that were used, I would, in my opinion, not place, I would not take a lot of what was said as credible.
I again object on speculating under the credibility of the statement.
Sustained.
Okay.
From the materials you examined, in your opinion, in your training and experience, was Mr. Bahena Rivera at any time treated as a witness?
As a witness?
Yes.
No.
In your opinion, you believe that Mr. Rivera was susceptible to coercive techniques?
I believe so.
You believe his minimal language skills had anything to do with this?
I wouldn't want to make an opinion on that, simply because I don't understand Spanish and I don't know where that might have been an impact. But language skills can become an issue, but I just myself couldn't see that in this because I don't understand Spanish.
I'm going to ask my counsel to pull up on the screen now the exhibit Y, the PowerPoint. And we're just going to thumb through this quickly. And just kind of have, these are still photos of the video that you took yourself, noting times where Mr. Bahena had either fallen asleep or appeared sleepy, right?
That's correct.
And
And
again-
it's from my report.
And those are all captured in your report as well?
That's correct.
And you said there were 60 times
I believe 60 I counted.
And there are times in that presentation, Exhibit Y, where Mr. Bahena is sleeping even before he is afforded his Miranda advisory.
Sorry, ask that question again?
Does it appear to you, from your review of the video, that Mr. Bahena showed times where he was actually physically sleeping before he was afforded his Miranda
That's
advisory?
correct.
Were you able to view a video of the squad car or any body cam from the moment Mr. Bahena Rivera left the Powashik County Sheriff's Office until they arrived at the location where Ms. Tibbetts' body was located?
No.
You find that unusual?
Well, I would, yes, a little bit. I would find that there was video from, there was audio, which is, I believe, I looked at from the crime scene, and there was video in the interrogation room, but I had asked for anything that had occurred from the time he left to the time that they got to the crime scene, and I had not gotten anything like that, so I don't know if it exists or not.
Did you review video of the crime scene where Mr. Bahena was interviewed once again?
Audio.
And there was also notations there that, once again, Mr. Bahena was tired and sleepy.
Correct. In fact, they acknowledge that.
And that is shown toward the end of Exhibit
Yes.
Y, pages 80, 79, 80.
Okay, so basically up until that point, it was acknowledged of how tired he was. Go back to where it just begins, 5 or 4.
That's your report page.
Yeah, I'll say my report, page 108, but is it before this? Yeah, 4-3, okay, so 2, is there one before? Okay, so go down to the next, okay, so next page. All right, so on part 3, page 85, 86, you fell asleep already. This is an acknowledgement of the sleep by PR, and then basically PR then says, oh, so you can eat. It's not that big, but it's something, okay, and then continue. And then on page 86, it refers to, on part 3, it's, Cristhian, how are you? Rivera says, sleepy. And let's go back one. And sleepy, eh? And then the next page, which is now going into part 4. How are you? Tired? Rivera, a little. That's part 4, page 99. Part 5, page 108. Are you sleepy, Cristhian? A little. Okay, well, it seems like just you and me right now. Chuckles. Whatever, right? And then part 5 goes into page 108. Report page 108. PR, Cristhian, stretch your feet. Rivera, PR, right, are waiting outside, and Rivera, okay. And then PR, you sleepy, right? Take your cap off, Cristhian. And then on page 108 of my report, part 5, Rivera, what are you asking me? PR, what are you doing? And please, you're already tired. I'm tired. And then on page 109, referring to part 5, PR, you tell me how you are. Rivera, tired. I'm tired too.
Well, let me stop you there. We go to the very last page of the presentation, and again, this is at the scene but it just mentions that he's been up since yesterday at 4:30 a.m.
By this, yeah, okay,
So again, that's just you noting
right.
his lack of sleep.
And this is from the transcripts, and these are all from the transcripts.
Okay.
And then on this particular, top page 19, bottom of page, top of page 20, Romero, are you tired? Rivera, yes. Romero, you have been awake since what time? Romero, yesterday at 4:30.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Cross-examination?
Mr. Leslie, your business name is Criminal Case Consultants, is that correct?
Correct,
You have two offices you indicated in Buffalo and Toronto.
correct.
Who else works, or how many other employees work for your business?
I have one other employee,
Is that a full-time employee?
no, part-time.
And what does that employee do?
They work on basically doing transcripts sometimes for videos.
It's like a support staff
Yeah,
position?
support staff.
And you have one other employee, and that includes both locations?
That's correct.
Do you have a physical office, or is it in your home?
No, physical offices.
You've had this business for 6 years?
About 6, 7 years, yeah.
When's the last time you were a police officer?
I left in 93.
So you have not worked in law enforcement since 1993?
Correct.
And the department that you left was, what department?
Sarnia.
I'm sorry?
Sarnia, Ontario.
How do you spell that?
SARNIA.
How big was that department?
130 officers.
How large was the jurisdiction?
I really couldn't tell you. It's population, I'm going to say 80,000, 100,000.
What was your position in that department?
Constable.
What does that mean?
That's the same as an officer.
Okay, did you work major cases?
Yes,
Okay, homicides?
I've worked homicides, yeah.
Okay, homicides in that particular department?
Well, your first response to those departments, yes.
So you're more of a patrol officer in
But,
Sarnia?
but there you do a lot of your own investigative work. Much like in smaller departments, you're not working in a CID necessarily, you are that CID.
Prior to that, in law enforcement experience, where were you at before that?
Before that, I was in, let me think, I'd have to go back to my CV. Macklin, Ontario, Macklin, Saskatchewan.
And how large was that department?
That department was 2 men, and 1 man, primarily me. I was the chief there.
So small department.
Sure.
Any other agencies you worked for?
Yeah, I've worked in Weyburn, I've worked in Luceland, I've worked in Hinton, and I did my training with Edmonton PD.
Do you know approximately how many homicides you were the lead investigator in?
Going back that many years,
An estimate is fine.
2 or 3 at that time.
So you were a lead investigator in your entire law enforcement career in homicides 2 to 3 times?
2 or 3 times, that's correct.
How many, in those homicides, how many interviews or interrogations did you do?
Oh, I've dealt, well, it's not just in the homicide side of it. Interrogations were done as, would be the equivalent of felonies, of felony type offenses.
I'm asking specifically about
In homicides?
the 2 or
Probably
3
2 or
homicides.
3.
I'm sorry?
2 or 3.
You
Hold
did
on
it,
just a second. Hold on.
sorry.
One at a time. We're talking over each other.
Sorry.
We've got a core reporter taking everything down. Just one at a time.
Okay.
So on the 2 to 3 homicides, those would have been with what jurisdiction, if you know?
But at Hinton, mostly.
All right, so what year would that have been?
We're going back to 78. 78, 79.
So is it accurate in, with regard to your training, that you have not worked in a homicide since that time?
Probably, that's correct. However, I've dealt with what I do now. I've done over 90 cases.
I understand. The books that you have written are listed in your CV, is that correct?
That's correct.
Hang on just one second. One is called Visual Liar, is that right?
That's correct.
Who published that?
It's self-published,
You published it yourself?
self-published, yes.
All right. Well, what's the other book,
Deception of a Witness,
and who published that?
self-published.
Have you published a book that has been approved, a manuscript has been approved by a publisher?
No.
You indicated you testified in the United States?
Yes,
I think specifically you said you testified in the state of Minnesota.
yes.
What county was that in?
I could tell you on my CV.
Is it in your CV,
It's in my CV,
the actual location?
I believe, if I can just refer to it. I didn't put the county down, but
Do you recall the county?
I don't recall the county, no. It's the Miller case.
Miller?
Yeah,
Would you know approximately what year that was?
it would have been 2018.
Was it a homicide?
Nope.
What kind of case was it?
It was a child abuse case, physical abuse.
You've also testified in military courts?
That's correct.
Were you in the military?
No,
What branch of the military did you testify in?
Army.
On how many different occasions?
It-
Is it listed in your CV?
Yes, most of them would be listed in my CV.
Hang on just 1 second.
And there's letters in there that basically verify that, so.
That's good. Sorry. So in this case, are you aware, or well, let me back up. You had talked about the video not having date or timestamps on it, correct?
Correct.
You're not suggesting the video is actually edited, right?
No.
You don't have any evidence of
No.
that, correct?
No.
And there is physical evidence that's associated in this case with Mr. Rivera that connects him to Mollie Tibbetts' death. Would you agree?
I didn't look at any evidence outside of the interviews themselves.
Were you provided any other information that may have independently corroborated Christian Rivera's statement?
I was given a lot of discovery, which I don't necessarily always look at, only because I want to focus on the interrogation itself.
Well,
Let me just.
Go ahead.
Yeah. If there was interviews with witnesses and things like that, that I found that would be pertinent, I usually look at those as well. But in this particular case, I just focused, it was such a large undertaking just on the interrogation itself. That's what I looked at.
Well, it would be important in determining the veracity of a statement, whether or not there was independent evidence that might confirm it, correct?
That's correct.
How about blood in Christian Rivera's car that belongs to Mollie Tibbetts? That would be something independent of the interview that might corroborate his involvement.
That'd be correct.
How about the fact that he led officers to her body? That would be independent, correct?
Yes, it would be independent.
I mean, there's nothing in the interview or in the facts of the case that would suggest the officers knew the location of Mollie Tibbetts,
There's
correct?
nothing indicating that.
Nothing indicating prior to the interview of Christian Rivera as to the location of Mollie Tibbetts, correct?
That's correct.
Christian Rivera obviously knew where she was located, correct?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that, based on that, I'm not going to presume that, but I would assume that they were led to there.
By him.
I didn't have any confirmation of anything that was talked about in the vehicle on the way down, so I really couldn't
Officers testified that Christian Rivera led them to Mollie Tibbetts' body.
Okay, but
Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not aware what testimony has already been done here. But all I'm saying is that I'm not aware of, and I won't give an opinion on something I didn't see. For example, if I had listened to a conversation that took place between the time they left the station and the time they got to the crime scene, I would be able to make an opinion, but I won't at this particular time, not without that
Do
information.
you have any other information in what you were provided that anyone other than Christian Rivera would have known the location of Mollie Tibbetts?
No.
Whenever this interview begins, Christian Rivera denies any knowledge as to what happened to Mollie Tibbetts, correct?
That's correct.
As the interview progresses, he admits seeing her in the area that she was jogging
That's correct.
on the day that she disappeared.
That's correct.
We have evidence that his vehicle was seen on a surveillance video. Are you aware of that?
Yes,
And that's in the area where she was last seen.
that's correct.
That surveillance video would certainly be independent of any interview, correct?
That's correct.
And would
Independent.
potentially be something that could be used to corroborate any statement he would have given to the police, correct?
Could be, yes.
Also, during that interview, he provides a narrative to the officers as to a confrontation he had with Mollie Tibbetts on a county road outside of Brooklyn.
That's correct.
He indicates in some of that interview that he blacked out, that he can't remember it, correct?
Yes.
All right. You talked about blacking out in terms
Well,
of,
yeah, sort
I
of.
mean, earlier, in terms of drug users, and
That's correct, yes.
you used that as an example.
It
Whenever,
wasn't, it wasn't associated to this situation, though.
I'm not suggesting
Okay.
that you were trying to say that, but the blacking out is more or less an amnesia, wouldn't that be true?
I'm not a doctor, I guess.
We can't remember something,
Yeah,
right?
that's correct.
Okay, and he never said that he stabbed Mollie Tibbetts, correct?
That's correct.
He did say there was a confrontation on the road. Is that
Yes,
right?
he did say that, yes.
All right, he indicates that there was blood.
Yes,
He indicates there was blood on numerous occasions, correct?
yes,
He tells officers that he had put her in the trunk.
that's correct.
All right, and we have blood in Christian Rivera's trunk. You're aware of that, correct?
I'm not aware of anything physical evidence-wise, other than just what I was provided.
You weren't provided a DNA report?
I was, but I didn't look at it for the reasons that I want to focus on just the, and I have it
I
here.
just, that's what I don't get,
Okay.
Mr. Leslie. Why wouldn't you look for something that would independently corroborate
Well,
his statement? Why wouldn't you look at that?
To answer the question of the DNA, because I'm not a DNA expert, number one.
What, there's a DNA report by a
Okay.
DNA analyst from the crime lab
I understand.
at the DCI lab.
That's correct.
Do you have any reason to question its veracity?
No, I have no reason to
Those
question.
reports put Mollie Tibbetts' DNA, blood, in Christian Rivera's vehicle, and you don't think that's important?
Well, I am not a DNA expert, so I'm not going to draw conclusions based on that. It is physical evidence,
So
yes.
you're not looking for anything that would independently corroborate the statement of Christian Rivera,
I was
right?
asked to look at the interrogation part of the interview. That's
But
what I was.
surely part of that analysis has to be some looking for independent corroboration.
No, it's not the investigation. I was looking at the interrogation.
I understand you were looking at the interrogation.
Whatever's in the paper, whatever's on the transcript, that's what I'm looking at.
So you didn't look at the surveillance video?
I looked at some surveillance video, but it virtually, at this particular point, I just was looking at the
You were
interrogation.
provided a DNA report that put Mollie Tibbetts' blood in the vehicle that Christian Rivera is associated with, and you set that aside, correct?
Yeah, correct. I understand what you're saying. I just say that I'm focusing on the interrogation. That's what I was asked to focus on. That's what I did focus on.
And Christian Rivera himself took the officers to her body. You're aware of that?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Are you aware that officers have been searching multiple fields and areas looking for her?
I understand.
So there is no way that officers could interject into an interview the location of her body, correct?
I agree.
Because they didn't know it, right?
I agree.
And the DNA that's in the trunk, the blood, the officers would not have had that report at the time of the interview or interrogation, correct?
We wouldn't have which report?
Wouldn't have the DNA report. It was done later.
Okay, I wouldn't be aware of that, but
So in the interview, Mr. Leslie,
right.
initially, Cristhian Rivera says he never harmed Mollie Tibbetts,
Right,
right? He later says that he did,
yes, correct.
all right? Officers can certainly bring up, and it's valid, to ask a witness, or ask somebody they're interviewing about inconsistencies, right?
That's correct.
I'm assuming as an officer yourself, if a witness, whether you were interrogating them or interviewing them, provided you inconsistencies, you might confront them with those, is that
Absolutely,
correct?
that's correct.
Did you ever talk to Cristhian Rivera?
Never.
Were you ever, you would not do that?
I would not do that.
I mean, as an, I'm sorry, as an expert hired by the defense, you.
That's correct. I
That's
would
not
not.
something you would do?
No.
You indicated in your report that you had some sort of information that the door leading out of the sheriff's office is locked.
Well, here's what I think I made the comment of, I was not aware of what I heard every time that somebody would come in to the interrogation room. I understand that the one door was unlocked. That was pretty evident. But I kept hearing almost like a card slide, and I asked the attorneys to check that. And they said that yes, that door was card accessed, but a person could leave.
Okay, so going from the doorway into the interview room, you can leave that room. He could have left,
Sure.
correct? Walked down the hallway, turned a doorknob, and walked
Probably.
out.
I wasn't there, so I'm only going by what I was told.
I
so.
understand, but we have photos, I don't have to show them. By the way, have you ever gone to the sheriff's office?
No.
You ever been there?
No.
Did you ever ask to go?
No.
Did you ever ask to look at the interview
Well,
room?
first of all, I'm not in town to do that, so I mean,
Did you ever ask to go?
no,
Okay, you've been here for a couple days, right?
true.
And we have photos that show you turn the handle in the hallway that leads to the interview room, and you're out into the lobby, which is the public area of the sheriff's office. You don't have any reason to dispute that,
No,
correct?
absolutely not.
And then push
In fact, it was confirmed by the attorneys. I asked them to check on that for me.
and then push two handles and you're outside, correct?
That's what I've been told, yes.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
A redirect?
Yes. I'll try to dial it down a little bit, Mr. Leslie.
That's
okay?
fine.
Now, at the time of the 11.5-hour interview.
Sure.
Or interrogation of Mr. Rivera, law enforcement didn't have Mollie Tibbetts' blood in the DNA results, did they?
Sorry, rephrase that again?
The DNA sample that Mr. Brown just referred, at the time that Mr. Rivera was being interrogated, they didn't have that, did they?
I don't believe so. I believe you handed me a DNA report at one point, later on than that.
And as far as leading law enforcement to the body, that came at the end of the interview, right?
That's correct.
So your analysis of their techniques and their exploitation of vulnerabilities, whatever, has all to do with how they were doing it to get to that point, right?
That's correct.
So the corroboration of stuff later on down the road came as a result of what they did at the beginning.
That's correct.
So that's what you were focusing on.
That's what I was focusing on.
So the deductive method is what we're talking about from the jump, right?
That's correct.
And then the way they got there is the problem, right?
Correct.
The way they got to Miss Tibbetts' body, for instance, is the problem.
Okay, yes, I agree.
And you have knowledge that the state has conceded that the Miranda warning that was given was defective by Ms. Romero, right?
That's correct.
And that, based upon that defective Miranda warning, that's how they got to Ms. Tibbetts' body, right?
That's correct.
I'm not objecting to leading.
Sustained. Make sure you ask open-ended questions.
Are you aware of any admissions by the state through pleadings of Miranda violations by Ms.
Yes.
Romero? What's your understanding?
Well, I received the document of, basically that you had sent me regarding to the response of the prosecutor on this, that they had conceded to the Miranda not being read properly.
So Mr. Brown can get excited as you want, but he also has admitted through court filings that there was a Miranda violation. Is that your understanding?
I'm not objecting. It's been asked and answered. The pleadings also speak for themselves, whether I'm worked up about anything or not.
Overruled.
Sorry, what was the question
Can you
again?
read back, please?
So Mr. Brown can get as excited as he wants, but he also has admitted through the court filings that there was a Miranda violation.
Yes.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Anything else to this witness, Mr. Brown?
No.
Mr. Leslie, thank you for being here. You're excused.
Thank you.
Defense may call their next witness.
Defense has no further witnesses and rests, Your Honor.
Just want to then confirm on the record, Mr. Brown, from the state standpoint, you have got all the exhibits in and you've presented all the witnesses you wish to present at this time.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Same question for the defense. The only caveat being is, I understand your desire to have BB admitted. Been through that. I've ruled on it. You've preserved your record. But beyond BB, just want to confirm the defense has the exhibits in they've asked me to consider, along with all the witnesses have been called.
Yes.
Mr. Brown, I do have just I want to be just real clear on a housekeeping matter from my standpoint, and that is the flash drive you have given me. Would you tell me what exhibits are found on the flash drive?
All of the state's exhibits are on the flash drive, 1 through 22. I know we gave you hard copies of all but 3 of the photos, but the entirety of the interview video is on there. The transcripts that were transcribed from the interview are on there, and neither of those obviously are printed. The video, which contains the audio of the interview that was conducted in the vehicle near the cornfield, is also on there. So all of our exhibits, some of them are printed for you, but all of them are on the flash drive.
And the only thing that I want to clarify is, I just want to make sure, I do not have a hard copy of Exhibit 2, which is the transcript of the interview.
You do not.
Okay.
Yeah, the entirety of it is on the flash drive, plus the transcription of the interview that was in the car near the cornfield.
Counsel, it is my intention to take this matter under advisement and get you a ruling as quickly as I can. Before we close the record, Mr. Brown, anything else on behalf of the state we need to address today?
No, Your Honor.
Anything else on behalf of the defense?
A couple things, Your Honor. We have not uploaded our exhibits yet. I did that because a number of photographs that we've offered, I think, are sensitive. I wanted the court's permission to either file them with an enhanced security level or under seal, so they aren't necessarily out there for the world to see.
I do not anticipate that being a problem, but I want to make sure that whatever exhibits you're proposing have that higher security. You've shared that information with the state.
Sure.
And the state, I guess, does not have any objection to that.
No.
But again, I do not anticipate that being a problem, but I just want to be clear as to which exhibits you're talking about.
Judge, if I might, I think all of the exhibits that we have, or at least most of them, I mean, we have a trial to concern ourselves with in February, so we have transcripts of the interview, the entirety of the interview. I think it might be best, we're not gonna upload those videos, but it might be best to give them all an enhanced security level in an effort to,
Across the board, everything.
yeah, I agree. Yes, I would say that would be the right thing to do.
Mr. Freeze, if that makes sense?
I agree with that.
Okay. Why don't you then prepare and submit an order setting it at a higher security level for all exhibits that were offered and accepted into evidence for both sides?
Got it.
Anything else?
No.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and with that, we'll close the record.
Judge, I do have a hard copy of Exhibit A. It's the transcript. Do you want a hard copy, or would you prefer it just be an email? I didn't put A in that exhibit binder.